Chapter 10. Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Little Men. Life at Plumefield with Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 10. Home Again. July had come and haying begun. The little gardens were doing finely, and long summer days were full of pleasant hours. The house stood open from morning till night, and the lads lived out of doors, except at school time. The lessons were short, and there were many holidays, for the Barrs believed in cultivating healthy bodies by much exercise, and our short summers are best used in out-of-door work. Such a rosy, sunburnt, hearty set as the boys became, such appetites as they had, such sturdy arms and legs as outgrew jackets and trousers, such laughing and racing all over the place, such antics in house and barn, such adventures in the tramps over hill and dale, and such satisfaction in the hearts of the worthy Barrs, as they saw their flock prospering in mind and body, I cannot begin to describe. Only one thing was needed to make them quite happy, and it came when they least expected it. One balmy night when the little lads were in bed, the elder ones bathing down at the brook, and Mrs. Barr undressing Teddy in her parlour, he suddenly cried out, "Oh, my Danny!" and pointed to the window, where the moon shone brightly. "No, lovey, he is not there. It was the pretty moon," said his mother. "No, no, Danny at window. Teddy saw him," persisted baby, much excited. It might have been, and Mrs. Barr hurried to the window, hoping it would prove true, but the face was gone, and nowhere appeared any signs of a mortal boy. She called his name, ran to the front door with Teddy in his little shirt, and made him call too, thinking the baby voice might have more effect than her own. No one answered, nothing appeared, and they went back much disappointed. Teddy would not be satisfied with the moon, and after he was in his crib kept popping up his head to ask if Danny was not tummin' soon. By and by he fell asleep. The lads trooped up to bed. The house grew still, and nothing but the chirp of the crickets broke the soft silence of the summer night. Mrs. Barr sat sewing, for the big basket was always piled with socks, full of potentious holes, and thinking of the lost boy. She had described that baby had been mistaken, and did not even disturb Mr. Barr by telling him of the child's fancy, for the poor man got little time to himself till the boys were abed, and he was busy writing letters. It was past 10 when she rose to shut up the house. As she paused a minute to enjoy the lovely scene from the steps, something white caught her eye on one of the haycocks scattered over the lawn. The children had been playing there all the afternoon, and fancying that Nan had left her hat as usual, Mrs. Barr went out to get it. But as she approached, she saw that it was neither hat nor handkerchief, but a shirt sleeve with a brown hand sticking out of it. She hurried round the haycock, and there lay Dan, fast asleep. Ragged, dirty, thin, and worn out he looked. One foot was bare, the other tied up in the old gingham jacket which he had taken from his own back to use as a clumsy bandage for some hurt. He seemed to have hidden himself behind the haycock, but in his sleep had thrown out the arm that had betrayed him. He sighed and muttered, as if his dreams disturbed him, and once when he moved, he groaned as if in pain, but still slept on quite spent with weariness. "He must not lie here," said Mrs. Barr, and stooping over him she gently called his name. He opened his eyes and looked at her, as if she was a part of his dream, for he smiled and said drowsily, "Mother Barr, I've come home." The look, the words, touched her very much, and she put her hand under his head to lift him up, saying in her cordial way, "I thought you would, and I'm so glad to see you, Dan." He seemed to wake thoroughly then, and started up looking about him as if he suddenly remembered where he was, and doubted even that kind welcome. His face changed, and he said in his old rough way, "I was going off in the morning. I only stopped to peek in as I went by." "But why not come in, Dan? Didn't you hear us call you? Teddy saw and cried for you." "Didn't suppose you'd let me in," he said, fumbling with a little bundle which he had taken up as if going immediately. "Try and see," was all Mrs. Barr answered, holding out her hand and pointing to the door, where the light shone hospitably. With a long breath, as if a load was off his mind, Dan took up a stout stick, and began to limp towards the house, but stopped suddenly, to say inquiringly, "Mr. Barr won't like it. I ran away from Page." "He knows it, and was sorry, but it will make no difference. Are you lame?" asked Mrs. Joe, as he limped on again. "Getting over a wall-stone fell on my foot and smashed it. I don't mind," and he did his best to hide the pain each step cost him. Mrs. Barr helped him into her own room, and once there he dropped into a chair and laid his head back, white and faint with weariness and suffering. "My poor Dan, drink this, and then eat a little. You are at home now, and Mother Barr will take good care of you." He only looked up at her with eyes full of gratitude, as he drank the wine she held to his lips, and then began slowly to eat the food she brought him. Each mouthful seemed to put heart into him, and presently he began to talk as if anxious to have her know all about him. "Where have you been, Dan?" she asked, beginning to get out some bandages. "I ran off more'n a month ago. Page was good enough, but too strict. I didn't like it, so I cut away down the river with a man who was going in his boat. That's why they couldn't tell where I'd gone. When I left the man I worked for a couple of weeks with a farmer, but I thrashed his boy, and then the old man thrashed me, and I ran off again and walked here." "All the way?" "Yes. The man didn't pay me, and I wouldn't ask for it. Took it out in beating the boy," and Dan laughed, yet looked ashamed, as he glanced at his ragged clothes and dirty hands. "How did you live? It was a long, long tramp for a boy like you." "Oh, I got on well enough, till I hurt my foot. Folks gave me things to eat, and I slept in barns and tramped by day. I got lost trying to make a short cut, or I'd have been here sooner." "But if you did not mean to come in and stay with us, what were you going to do?" "I thought I'd like to see Teddy again, and you, and then I was going back to my old work in the city, only I was so tired I went to sleep on the hay. I'd have been gone in the morning if you hadn't found me." "Are you sorry I did?" And Mrs. Joe looked at him with a half merry, half reproachful look, as she knelt down to look at his wounded foot. The colour came up in Dan's face, and he kept his eyes fixed on his plate, as he said very low, "No, ma'am, I'm glad. I wanted to stay, but I was afraid you—" He did not finish, for Mrs. Barr interrupted him by an exclamation of pity, as she saw his foot, for it was seriously hurt. "When did you do it?" "3 days ago." "And you have walked on it in this state?" I had a stick and I washed it at every brook I came to, and one woman gave me a rag to put on it. Mr. Barr must see and dress it at once," and Mrs. Joe hastened into the next room, leaving the door ajar behind her, so that Dan heard all that passed. "Fritz, the boy has come back." "Who, Dan?" "Yes. Teddy saw him at the window and he called to him, but he went away and hid behind the haycocks on the lawn. I found him there just now fast asleep, and half dead with weariness and pain. He ran away from Page a month ago, and has been making his way to us ever since. He pretends that he did not mean to let us see him, but go on to the city and his old work after a look at us. It is evident, however, that the hope of being taken in has led him here through everything, and there is waiting to know if you will forgive and take him back." "Did he say so?" "His eyes did, and when I waked him he said, like a lost child, 'Mother Barr, I've come home.' I hadn't the heart to scold him, and just took him in like a poor little black sheep come back to the fold. I may keep him, Fritz." "Of course you may. This proves to me that we have a hold on the boy's heart, and I would no more send him away now than I would my own Rob." Dan heard a soft little sound, as if Mrs. Joe thanked her husband without words, and, in the instant silence that followed, two great tears that had slowly gathered in the boy's eyes brimmed over and rolled down his dusty cheeks. No one saw them, for he brushed them hastily away, but in that little pause I think Dan's old distrust for these good people vanished forever. The soft spot in his heart was touched, and he felt an impetuous desire to prove himself worthy of the love and pity that was so patient and forgiving. He said nothing. He only wished the wish with all his might, resolved to try in his blind boyish way, and sealed his resolution with the tears which neither pain, fatigue, nor loneliness could wring from him. "Come and see his foot. I'm afraid it is badly hurt, for he is kept on 3 days through heat and dust, with nothing but water and an old jacket to bind it up with. I tell you, Fritz, that boy is a brave lad, and will make a fine man yet." "I hope so for your sake, enthusiastic woman. Your faith deserves success. Now, I will go and see your little Spartan. Where is he?" "In my room, but, dear, you'll be very kind to him, no matter how gruff he seems. I am sure that is the way to conquer him. He won't bear sternness nor much restraint, but a soft word and infinite patience will lead him as it used to lead me." "As if you ever liked this little rascal!" cried Mr. Barr, laughing, yet half angry at the idea. "I was in spirit, though I showed it in a different way. I seem to know by instinct how he feels, to understand what will win and touch him, and to sympathize with his temptations and faults. I am glad I do, for it will help me to help him, and if I can make a good man of this wild boy, it will be the best work of my life. God bless the work and help the worker." Mr. Barr spoke now as earnestly as she had done, and both came in together to find Dan's head down upon his arm, as if he was quite overcome by sleep. But he looked up quickly, and tried to rise as Mr. Barr said pleasantly, "So you like Plumfield better than Page's farm? Well, let us see if we can get on more comfortably this time than we did before." "Thank you, sir," said Dan, trying not to be gruff, and finding it easier than he expected. "Now the foot. Ouch! This is not well. We must have Dr. Firth tomorrow. Warm water, Joe, and old linen." Mr. Barr bathed and bound up the wounded foot, while Mrs. Joe prepared the only empty bed in the house. It was in the little guest chamber leading from the parlour, and often used when the lads were poorly, for it saved Mrs. Joe from running up and down, and the invalids could see what was going on. When it was ready, Mr. Barr took the boy in his arms, and carried him in, helped him undress, laid him on the little white bed, and left him with another handshake, and a fatherly "Good night, my son." Dan dropped asleep at once, and slept heavily for several hours. Then his foot began to throb and ache, and he awoke to toss about uneasily, trying not to groan lest anyone should hear him, for he was a brave lad, and did bear pain like a little Spartan, as Mr. Barr called him. Mrs. Joe had a way of flitting about the house at night, to shut the windows if the wind grew chilly, to draw mosquito curtains over Teddy, or look after Tommy, who occasionally walked in his sleep. The least noise waked her, and as she often heard imaginary robbers, cats, and conflagrations, the doors stood open all about, so her quick ear caught the sound of Dan's little moans, and she was up in a minute. He was just giving his hot pillow a despairing thump, when a light came glimmering through the hall, and Mrs. Joe crept in, looking like a droll ghost, with her hair in a great knob on the top of her head, and a long grey dressing gown trailing behind her. "Are you in pain, Dan?" "It's pretty bad, but I didn't mean to wake you. I'm a sort of owl, always flying about at night. Yes, your foot is like fire. The bandages must be wet again." And away flapped the maternal owl for more cooling stuff, and a great mug of ice water. "Oh, that's so nice," sighed Dan. The wet bandages went on again, and a long draught of water cooled his thirsty throat. "There now, sleep your best, and don't be frightened if you see me again, for I'll slip down by and by, and give you another sprinkle." As she spoke, Mrs. Joe stooped to turn the pillow and smooth the bedclothes, when, to her great surprise, Dan put his arm around her neck, drew her face down to his, and kissed her, with a broken "Thank you, ma'am," which said more than the most eloquent speech could have done, for the hasty kiss, the muttered words, meant "I'm sorry, I will try." She understood it, accepted the unspoken confession, and did not spoil it by any token of surprise. She only remembered that he had no mother, kissed the brown cheek half hidden on the pillow, as if ashamed of the little touch of tenderness, and left him, saying what he long remembered: "You are my boy now, and if you choose, you can make me proud and glad to say so." Once again, just at dawn, she stole down to find him so fast asleep that he did not wake, and showed no sign of consciousness as she wet his foot, except that the lines of pain smoothed themselves away, and left his face quite peaceful. The day was Sunday, and the house so still that he never waked till near noon, and, looking round him, saw an eager little face peering in at the door. He held out his arms, and Teddy tore across the room to cast himself bodily upon the bed, shouting, "My Danny's tum!" as he hugged and wriggled with delight. Mrs. Barr appeared next, bringing breakfast, and never seeming to see how shamefaced Dan looked at the memory of the little scene last night. Teddy insisted on giving him his breakfast, and fed him like a baby, which, as he was not very hungry, Dan enjoyed very much. Then came the doctor, and the poor Spartan had a bad time of it, for some of the little bones in his foot were injured, and putting them to rights was such a painful job, that Dan's lips were white, and great drops stood on his forehead. though he never cried out, and only held Mrs. Joe's hand so tight that it was red long afterwards. "You must keep this boy quiet for a week at least, and not let him put his foot to the ground. By that time I shall know whether he may hop a little with a crutch, or stick to his bed for a while longer," said Dr. Firth, putting up the shining instruments that Dan did not like to see. "It will get well some time, won't it?" he asked, looking alarmed at the word crutches. "I hope so," and with that the doctor departed, leaving Dan much depressed, for the loss of a foot is a dreadful calamity to an active boy. "Don't be troubled, I am a famous nurse, and we will have you tramping about as well as ever in a month," said Mrs. Joe, taking a hopeful view of the case. But the fear of being lame haunted Dan, and even Teddy's caresses did not cheer him, so Mrs. Joe proposed that one or two of the boys should come in and pay him a little visit, and ask whom he would like to see. "Nat and Demi, I'd like my hat too. There's something in it I guess they'd like to see. I suppose you threw away my bundle of plunder," said Dan, looking rather anxious as he put the question. "No, I kept it, for I thought they must be treasures of some kind. You took such care of them," and Mrs. Joe brought him his old straw hat, stuck full of butterflies and beetles, and a handkerchief containing a collection of odd things picked up on his way: birds' eggs, carefully done up in moss, curious shells and stones, bits of fungus, and several little crabs in a state of great indignation at their imprisonment. "Could I have something to put these fellows in? Mr. Hyde and I found 'em, and they are first-rate ones, so I'd like to keep and watch 'em, can I?" asked Dan, forgetting his foot, and laughing to see the crabs go sidling and backing over the bed. "Of course you can. Polly's old cage will be just the thing. Don't let them nip Teddy's toes while I get it," and away went Mrs. Joe, leaving Dan overjoyed to find that his treasures were not considered rubbish and thrown away. Nat, Demi, and the cage arrived together, and the crabs were settled in their new house, to the great delight of the boys, who in the excitement of the performance forgot any awkwardness they might otherwise have felt in greeting the runaway. To these admiring listeners Dan related his adventures much more fully than he had done to the bars. Then he displayed his plunder, and described each article so well, that Mrs. Joe, who had retired to the next room to leave them free, was surprised and interested, as well as amused, at their boyish chatter. "How much the lad knows of these things! How absorbed he is in them! And what a mercy it is just now, for he cares so little for books. It would be hard to amuse him while he is laid up, but the boys can supply him with beetles and stones to any extent, and I am glad to find out this taste of his. It is a good one, and may perhaps prove the making of him. If he should turn out a great naturalist, and Nat a musician, I should have cause to be proud of this year's work." And Mrs. Joe sat smiling over her book as she built castles in the air, just as she used to do when a girl, only then they were for herself, and now they were for other people, which is the reason perhaps that some of them came to pass in reality, for charity is an excellent foundation to build anything upon. Nat was most interested in the adventures, but Demi enjoyed the beetles and butterflies immensely, drinking in the history of their changeful little lives as if it were a new and lovely sort of fairy tale, for, even in his plain way, Dan told it well, and found great satisfaction in the thought that here at least the small philosopher could learn of him. So interested were they in the account of catching a muskrat, whose skin was among the treasures, that Mr. Barr had to come himself to tell Nat and Demi it was time for the walk. Dan looked so wistfully after them as they ran off that Father Barr proposed carrying him to the sofa in the parlour for a little change of air and scene. When he was established and the house quiet, Mrs. Joe, who sat near by showing Teddy pictures, said in an interested tone, as she nodded towards the treasures still in Dan's hands, "Where did you learn so much about these things?" "I always liked them, but didn't know much till Mr. Hyde told me." "Oh, he was a man who lived round in the woods studying these things, I don't know what you call him, and wrote about frogs, and fishes, and so on. He stayed at Page's and used to want me to go and help him, and it was great fun, 'cause he told me ever so much, and was uncommon jolly and wise. Hope I'll see him again some time." "I hope you will," said Mrs. Joe, for Dan's face had brightened up, and he was so interested in the matter that he forgot his usual taciturnity. Why, he could make birds come to him, and rabbits and squirrels didn't mind him any more than if he was a tree. "Did you ever tickle a lizard with a straw?" asked Dan eagerly. "No, but I should like to try it." "Well, I've done it, and it's so funny to see 'em turn over and stretch out. They like it so much. Mr. Hyde used to do it, and he'd make snakes listen to him while he whistled, and he knew just when certain flowers would blow, and bees wouldn't sting him, and he'd tell the wonderfulest things about fish and flies, and the Indians and the rocks." "I think you were so fond of going with Mr. Hyde, you rather neglected Mr. Page," said Mrs. Joe slyly. "Yes, I did. I hated to have to weed and hoe when I might be tramping round with Mr. Hyde. Page thought such things silly, and called Mr. Hyde crazy because he'd lay hours watching a trout or a bird." "Suppose you say lie instead of lay. It is better grammar," said Mrs. Joe very gently, and then added, "Yes, Page is a thorough farmer, and would not understand that a naturalist's work was just as interesting, and perhaps just as important, as his own. Now, Dan, if you really love these things, as I think you do, and I am glad to see it, you shall have time to study them and books to help you. But I want you to do something besides, and to do it faithfully, else you will be sorry by and by, and find that you have got to begin again." "Yes, ma'am," said Dan meekly, and looked a little scared by the serious tone of the last remark, for he hated books, yet had evidently made up his mind to study anything she proposed. "Do you see that cabinet with 12 drawers in it?" was the next very unexpected question. Dan did see 2 old-fashioned ones standing on either side of the piano. He knew them well, and had often seen nice bits of string, nails, brown paper, and such useful matters come out of the various drawers. He nodded and smiled. Mrs. Joe went on, "Well, don't you think those drawers would be good places to put your eggs, and stones, and shells, and lichens?" "Oh, splendid! But you wouldn't like my things cluttering round, as Mr. Page used to say, would you?" cried Dan, sitting up to survey the old piece of furniture with sparkling eyes. "I like litter of that sort, and if I didn't I should give you the drawers, because I have a regard for children's little treasures, and I think they should be treated respectfully. Now I am going to make a bargain with you, Dan, and I hope you will keep it honourably. Here are 12 good-sized drawers, one for each month of the year, and they shall be yours as fast as you earn them, by doing the little duties that belong to you. I believe in rewards of a certain kind, especially for young folks. They help us along, and though we may begin by being good for the sake of the reward, if it is rightly used, We shall soon learn to love goodness for itself." "Do you have 'em?" asked Dan, looking as if this was new talk for him. "Yes, indeed. I haven't learned to get on without them yet. My rewards are not drawers, or presents, or holidays, but they are things which I like as much as you do the others. The good behavior and success of my boys is one of the rewards I love best, and I work for it as I want you to work for your cabinet. Do what you dislike, and do it well, and you get two rewards: one, the prize you see and hold; the other, the satisfaction of a duty cheerfully performed. Do you understand that?" "Yes, ma'am." "We all need these little helps, so you shall try to do your lessons and your work, play kindly with all the boys, and use your holidays well, and if you bring me a good report, or if I see and know it without words, for I'm quick to spy out the good little efforts of my boys, you shall have a compartment in the drawer for your treasures. See, some are already divided into 4 parts, and I will have the others made in the same way, a place for each week, and when the drawer is filled with curious and pretty things, I shall be as proud of it as you are, prouder, I think, for in the pebbles, mosses, and gay butterflies, I shall see good resolutions carried out, conquered faults, and a promise well kept. Shall we do this, Dan?" The boy answered with one of the looks which said much, for it showed that he felt and understood her wish and words, although he did not know how to express his interest and gratitude for such care and kindness. She understood the look, and seeing by the colour that flushed up to his forehead that he was touched, as she wished him to be, she said no more about that side of the new plan, but pulled out the upper drawer, dusted it, and set it on 2 chairs before the sofa, saying briskly: "Now let us begin at once by putting those nice beetles in a safe place. These compartments will hold a good deal, you see. I'd pin the butterflies and bugs round the sides. They will be quite safe there, and leave room for the heavy things below. I'll give you some cotton wool, and clean paper and pins, and you can get ready for the week's work." "But I can't go out to find any new things," said Dan, looking piteously at his foot. "That's true. Never mind. We'll let these treasures do for this week, and I dare say the boys will bring you loads of things if you ask them." "They don't know the right sort. Besides, if I lie here all the time, I can't work and study and earn my drawers." "There are plenty of lessons you can learn lying there, and several little jobs of work you can do for me." "Can I?" and Dan looked both surprised and pleased. "You can learn to be patient and cheerful in spite of pain and no play. You can amuse Teddy for me, wind cotton, read to me when I sew, and do many things without hurting your foot, which will make the days pass quickly and not be wasted ones." Here Demi ran in with a great butterfly in one hand and a very ugly little toad in the other. "See, Dan, I found them, and ran back to give them to you. Aren't they beautiful ones?" panted Demi, all out of breath. Dan laughed at the toad, and said he had no place to put him, but the butterfly was a beauty, and if Mrs. Joe would give him a big pin, he would stick it right up in the drawer. "I don't like to see the poor thing struggle on a pin. If it must be killed, let us put it out of pain at once with a drop of camphor," said Mrs. Joe, getting out the bottle. "I don't know how to do it. Mr. Hyde always killed 'em that way, but I didn't have any camphor, so I used a pin," and Dan gently poured a drop on the insect's head, when the pale green wings fluttered an instant, and then grew still. This dainty little execution was hardly over when Teddy shouted from the bedroom: "Oh, the little traps are out, and the big one's eaten 'em all up." Demi and his aunt ran to the rescue and found Teddy dancing excitedly in a chair, while two little crabs were scuttling about the floor, having got through the wires of the cage. A third was clinging to the top of the cage, evidently in terror of his life, for below, a sad yet funny sight, the big crab had wedged himself into the little recess where Polly's cup used to stand, and there he sat eating one of his relations in the coolest way. All the claws of the poor victim were pulled off, and he was turned upside down, his upper shell held in one claw close under the mouth of the big crab like a dish, while he leisurely ate out of it with the other claw, pausing now and then to turn his queer bulging eyes from side to side, and to put out a slender tongue and lick them in a way that made the children scream with laughter. Mrs. Joe carried the cage in for Dan to see the sight, while Demi caught and confined the wanderers under an inverted washbowl. "I'll have to let these fellows go, for I can't keep 'em in the house," said Dan, with evident regret. "I'll take care of them for you, if you will tell me how, and they can live in my turtle tank just as well as not," said Demi, who found them more interesting even than his beloved slow turtles. So Dan gave him directions about the wants and habits of the crabs, and Demi bore them away to introduce them to their new home and neighbours. "What a good boy he is," said Dan, carefully settling the first butterfly, and remembering that Demi had given up his walk to bring it to him. "He ought to be, for a great deal has been done to make him so. He's had folks to tell him things, and to help him. I haven't," said Dan, with a sigh, thinking of his neglected childhood, a thing he seldom did, and feeling as if he had not had fair play somehow. "I know it, dear, and for that reason I don't expect as much from you as from Demi, though he is younger. You shall have all the help that we can give you now, and I hope to teach you how to help yourself in the best way. Have you forgotten what Father Barr told you when you were here before, about wanting to be good, and asking God to help you?" "No, ma'am," very low. "Do you try that way still?" "No, ma'am," lower still. "Will you do it every night to please me?" "Yes, ma'am," very soberly. "I shall depend on it, and I think I shall know if you are faithful to your promise, for these things always show to people who believe in them, though not a word is said. Now here is a pleasant story about a boy who hurt his foot worse than you did yours. Read it, and see how bravely he bore his troubles." She put that charming little book, The Crofton Boys, into his hands, and left him for an hour, passing in and out from time to time, that he might not feel lonely. Dan did not love to read, but soon got so interested that he was surprised when the boys came home. Daisy brought him a nosegay of wild flowers, and Nan insisted on helping bring him his supper, as he lay on the sofa with the door open into the dining room, so that he could see the lads at table, and they could nod socially to him over their bread and butter. Mr. Barr carried him away to his bed early, and Teddy came in his nightgown to say good night, for he went to his little nest with the birds. "I want to say my prayers to Danny, may I?" he asked, and when his mother said, "Yes," the little fellow knelt down by Dan's bed, and folding his chubby hands, said softly, "Please Dod, bless everybody, and help me to be dood." Then he went away smiling with sleepy sweetness over his mother's shoulder. But after the evening talk was done, the evening song sung, and the house grew still with beautiful Sunday silence, Dan lay in his pleasant room wide awake, thinking new thoughts, feeling new hopes and desires stirring in his boyish heart. But two good angels had entered in, Love and gratitude began the work which time and effort were to finish, and with an earnest wish to keep his first promise, Dan folded his hands together in the darkness and softly whispered Teddy's little prayer. "Please God, bless everyone, and help me to be good." End of chapter 10.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Catherine Monocchia. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys, by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 11. For a week, Dan only moved from bed to sofa. A long week and a hard one, for the hurt foot was very painful at times. The quiet days were very wearisome to the active lad, longing to be out enjoying the summer weather, and especially difficult was it to be patient. But Dan did his best, and everyone helped him in their various ways. So the time passed, and he was rewarded at last by hearing the doctor say on Saturday morning, "This foot is doing better than I expected. Give the lad the crutch this afternoon, and let him stump about the house a little." "Hooray!" shouted Nat, and raced away to tell the other boys the good news. Everybody was glad, and after dinner the whole flock assembled to behold Dan crutch himself up and down the hall a few times before he settled in the porch to hold a sort of levee. He was much pleased at the interest and goodwill shown him, and brightened up more and more every minute, for the boys came to pay their respects, the little girls fussed about him with stools and cushions, and Teddy watched over him as if he was a frail creature unable to do anything for himself. They were still sitting and standing about the steps, when a carriage stopped at the gate. A hat was waved from it, and with a shout of "Uncle Teddy! Uncle Teddy!" Rob scampered down the avenue as fast as his short legs would carry him. All the boys but Dan ran after him to see who should be first to open the gate, and in a moment the carriage drove up with boys swarming all over it, while Uncle Teddy sat laughing in the midst, with his little daughter on his knee. "Stop the triumphal car and let Jupiter descend," he said, and jumping out ran up the steps to meet Mrs. Bear, who stood smiling and clapping her hands like a girl. "How goes it, Teddy?" "All right, Joe." Then they shook hands, and Mr. Lorry put Bess into her aunt's arms, saying, as the child hugged her tight, "Goldilocks wanted to see you so much that I ran away with her, for I was quite pining for a sight of you myself. We want to play with your boys for an hour or so, and to see how the old woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children she did not know what to do is getting on." "I'm so glad. Play away and don't get into mischief," answered Mrs. Joe, as the lads crowded round the pretty child, admiring her long golden hair, dainty dress, and lofty ways, for the little princess, as they called her, allowed no one to kiss her, but sat smiling down upon them, and graciously patting their heads with her little white hands. They all adored her, especially Rob, who considered her a sort of doll, and dared not touch her lest she should break, but worshipped her at a respectful distance, made happy by an occasional mark of favour from her little highness. As she immediately demanded to see Daisy's kitchen, she was borne off by Mrs. Joe, with a train of small boys following. The others, all but Nat and Demi, ran away to the menagerie and gardens to have all in order, for Mr. Lorry always took a general survey, and looked disappointed if things were not flourishing. Standing on the steps, he turned to Dan, saying like an old acquaintance, though he had only seen him once or twice before, "How is the foot?" "Better, sir." "Rather tired of the house, aren't you?" "Guess I am." And Dan's eyes roved away to the green hills and woods where he longed to be. "Suppose we take a little turn before the others come back. That big, easy carriage will be quite safe and comfortable, and a breath of fresh air will do you good. Get a cushion and shawl, Demi, and let's carry Dan off." The boys thought it a capital joke, and Dan looked delighted, but asked with an unexpected burst of virtue, "Will Mrs. Bear like it?" "Oh, yes, we settled all that a minute ago." "You didn't say anything about it, so I don't see how you could," said Demi inquisitively. "We have a way of sending messages to one another, without any words. It is a great improvement on the telegraph." "I know its eyes. I saw you lift your eyebrows and nod toward the carriage, and Mrs. Bear laughed and nodded back again," cried Nat, who was quite at his ease with kind Mr. Lorry by this time. "Right. Now then, come on." and in a minute Dan found himself settled in the carriage, his foot on a cushion on the seat opposite, nicely covered with a shawl, which fell down from the upper regions in a most mysterious manner, just when they wanted it. Demi climbed up to the box beside Peter, the black coachman. Nat sat next to Dan in the place of honor, while Uncle Teddy would sit opposite to take care of the foot. He said, but really that he might study the faces before him, both so happy, yet so different, for Dan's was square and brown and strong, while Nat's was long and fair and rather weak, but very amiable with his mild eyes and good forehead. "By the way, I've got a book somewhere here that you might like to see," said the oldest boy of the party, diving under the seat, and producing a book which made Dan exclaim, "Oh, by George, isn't that a stunner?" as he turned the leaves and saw fine plates of butterflies and birds and every sort of interesting insect, colored like life. He was so charmed that he forgot his thanks, but Mr. Lorry did not mind, and was quite satisfied to see the boy's eager delight, and to hear his exclamations over certain old friends as he came to them. Nat leaned on his shoulder to look, and Demi turned his back to the horses, and let his feet dangle inside the carriage, so that he might join in the conversation. When they got among the beetles, Mr. Lorry took a curious little object out of his vest pocket, and laying it on the palm of his hand, said, "There's a beetle that is thousands of years old." And then, while the lads examined the queer stone bug, that looked so old and grey, he told them how it came out of the wrappings of a mummy, after lying for ages in a famous tomb. Finding them interested, he went on to tell about the Egyptians, and the strange and splendid ruins they have left behind them the Nile, and how he sailed up the mighty river with the handsome dark men to work his boat, how he shot alligators, saw wonderful beasts and birds, and afterwards crossed the desert on a camel, who pitched him about like a ship in a storm. "Uncle Teddy tells stories most as well as Grandpa," said Demi approvingly, when the tale was done, and the boy's eyes asked for more. "Thank you," said Mr. Lorry, quite soberly, for he considered Demi's praise worth having, for children are good critics in such cases, and to suit them is an accomplishment that any one may be proud of. "Here's another trifle or two that I tucked into my pocket as I was turning over my trap to see if I had anything that would amuse Dan." And Uncle Teddy produced a fine arrowhead and a string of wampum. "Oh, tell about the Indians!" cried Demi, who was fond of playing wigwam. "Dan knows a lot about them," added Nat. "More than I do, I dare say. Tell us something." And Mr. Lorry looked as interested as the other two. "Mr. Hyde told me he's been among 'em, and can talk their talk, and likes 'em," began Dan, flattered by their attention, but rather embarrassed by having a grown-up listener. "What is wampum for?" asked curious Demi from his perch. The others asked questions likewise, and before he knew it, Dan was reeling off all Mr. Hyde had told him, as they sailed down the river a few weeks before. Mr. Lorry listened well, but found the boy more interesting than the Indians, for Mrs. Joe had told him about Dan, and he rather took a fancy to the wild lad, who ran away as he himself had often longed to do, and who was slowly getting tamed by pain and patience. "I've been thinking that it would be a good plan for you fellows to have a museum of your own, a place in which to collect all the curious and interesting things that you find and make and have given you." Mrs. Joe was too kind to complain, but it is rather hard for her to have the house littered up with all sorts of rattle-traps, half a pint of door-bugs in one of her best vases, for instance, a couple of dead bats nailed up in the back entry, wasp nests tumbling down on people's heads, and stones lying round everywhere, enough to pave the avenue. There are not many women who would stand that sort of thing, are there now? As Mr. Lorry spoke with a merry look in his eyes, the boys laughed and nudged one another, for it was evident that someone told tales out of school, else how could he know of the existence of these inconvenient treasures? "Where can we put them, then?" said Demi, crossing his legs and leaning down to argue the question. "In the old carriage house." "But it leaks, and there isn't any window, nor any place to put things, and it's all dust and cobwebs," began Nat. "Wait till Gibbs and I have touched it up a bit, and then see how you like it. He is to come over on Monday to get it ready. Then next Saturday I shall come out, and we will fix it up, and make the beginning, at last, of a fine little museum. Every one can bring his things and have a place for them. and Dan is to be the head man, because he knows most about such matters, and it will be quiet, pleasant work for him now that he can't knock about much." "Won't that be jolly?" cried Nat, while Dan smiled all over his face and had not a word to say, but hugged his book and looked at Mr. Lorry as if he thought him one of the greatest public benefactors that ever blessed the world. "Shall I go round again, sir?" asked Peter, as they came to the gate, after 2 slow turns about the half-mile triangle. "No, we must be prudent, else we can't come again. I must go over the premises, take a look at the carriage house, and have a little talk with Mrs. Joe before I go." And having deposited Dan on his sofa to rest and enjoy his book, Uncle Teddy went off to have a frolic with the lads who were raging about the place in search of him. Leaving the little girls to mess upstairs, Mrs. Bear sat down by Dan, and listened to his eager account of the drive till the flock returned, dusty, warm, and much excited about the new museum, which every one considered the most brilliant idea of the age. "I always wanted to endow some sort of institution, and I'm going to begin with this," said Mr. Lorry, sitting down on a stool at Mrs. Joe's feet. "You have endowed one already. What do you call this?" And Mrs. Joe pointed to the happy-faced lads who had camped upon the floor about him. "I call it a very promising bear garden, and I'm proud to be a member of it. Did you know I was the head boy in this school?" he asked, turning to Dan, and changing the subject skillfully, for he hated to be thanked for the generous things he did. "I thought Franz was," answered Dan, wondering what the man meant. "Oh dear no, I'm the first boy Mrs. Joe ever had to take care of, and I was such a bad one that she isn't done with me yet, though she has been working at me for years and years." "How old she must be!" said Nat, innocently. "She began early, you see, poor thing. She was only 15 when she took me, and I led her such a life it's a wonder she isn't wrinkled and gray and quite worn out." And Mr. Lorry looked up at her laughing. "Don't, Teddy, I won't have you abuse yourself so," and Mrs. Joe stroked the curly black head at her knee as affectionately as ever, for, in spite of everything, Teddy was her boy still. "If it hadn't been for you, there never would have been a plum field. It was my success with you, sir, that gave me courage to try my pet plan. So the boys may thank you for it, and name the new institution the Lawrence Museum in honor of its founder, won't we, boys?" she added, looking very like the lively Joe of old times. "We will!" shouted the boys, throwing up their hats, for though they had taken them off on entering the house, according to rule, they had been in too much of a hurry to hang them up. "I'm as hungry as a bear. Can't I have a cookie?" asked Mr. Lorry, when the shout subsided and he had expressed his thanks by a splendid bow. "Trot out and ask Asia for the gingerbread box, Demi. It isn't in order to eat between meals, but on this joyful occasion we won't mind and have a cookie all round," said Mrs. Joe, and when the box came she dealt them out with a liberal hand, every one munching away in a social circle. Suddenly, in the midst of a bite, Mr. Lorry cried out, "Bless my heart, I forgot Grandma Bundle!" and running out to the carriage, returned with an interesting white parcel, which, being opened, disclosed a choice collection of beasts, birds, and pretty things cut out of crisp, sugary cake, and baked a lovely brown. "There's one for each, and a letter to tell which is whose. Grandma and Hannah made them, and I tremble to think what would have happened to me if I had forgotten to leave them." Then, amid much laughing and fun, the cakes were distributed, a fish for Dan, a fiddle for Nat, a book for Demi, a money for Tommy, a flower for Daisy, a hoop for Nan, who had driven twice round the triangle without stopping, a star for Emile, who put on airs because he studied astronomy, and best of all, an omnibus for Franz, whose great delight was to drive the family bus. Stuffy got a fat pig, and the little folks had birds and cats and rabbits with black currant eyes. "Now I must go. Where is my Goldilocks? Mamma will come flying out to get her if I'm not back early," said Uncle Teddy, when the last crumb had vanished, which it speedily did, you may be sure. The young ladies had gone into the garden, and while they waited till Franz looked them up, Joe and Lorry stood at the door talking together. "How does little Giddy Gaddy come on?" he asked, for Nan's pranks amused him very much, and he was never tired of teasing Joe about her. "Nicely. She is getting quite mannerly, and begins to see the error of her wild ways. Don't the boys encourage her in them?" "Yes, but I keep talking, and lately she has improved much. You saw how prettily she shook hands with you, and how gentle she was with Bess. Daisy's example has its effect upon her, and I'm quite sure that a few months will work wonders." Here Mrs. Joe's remarks were cut short by the appearance of Nan tearing round the corner at a breakneck pace, driving a mettlesome team of 4 boys, and followed by Daisy trundling Bess in a wheelbarrow. Hat off, hair flying, whip cracking, and barrow bumping, up they came in a cloud of dust, looking as wild a set of little hoydens as one would wish to see. "So these are the model children, are they? It's lucky I didn't bring Mrs. Curtis out to see your school for the cultivation of morals and manners. She would never have recovered from the shock of this spectacle," said Mr. Lorry, laughing at Mrs. Joe's premature rejoicing over Nan's improvement. "Laugh away, I'll succeed yet, as you used to say at college, quoting some professor, 'Though the experiment has failed, the principle remains the same,'" said Mrs. Bear, joining in merriment. "I'm afraid Nan's example is taking effect upon Daisy instead of the other way. Look at my little princess. She has utterly forgotten her dignity, and is screaming like the rest. Young ladies, what does this mean?" And Mr. Lorry rescued his small daughter from impending destruction, for the 4 horses were champing their bits and curveting madly all about her, as she sat brandishing a great whip in both hands. "We're having a race, and I beat," shouted Nan. "I could have run faster, only I was afraid of spilling Bess," screamed Daisy. "Hi, go long!" cried the princess, giving such a flourish with her whip that the horses ran away and were seen no more. "My precious child, come away from this ill-mannered crew before you are quite spoiled. Good-bye, Joe. Next time I come I shall expect to find the boys making patchwork." "It wouldn't harm them a bit. I don't give in, mind you, for my experience always fail a few times before they succeed. Love to Amy and my blessed Marmee," called Mrs. Joe as the carriage drove away, and the last Mr. Lorry saw of her she was consoling Daisy for her failure by a ride in the wheelbarrow, and looking as if she liked it. Great was the excitement all the week about the repairs in the carriage-house, which went briskly on in spite of the incessant questions, advice, and meddling of the boys. Old Gibbs was nearly driven wild with it all, but managed to do his work nevertheless, and by Friday night the place was all in order, roof mended, shelves up, walls whitewashed, and a great window cut at the back, which let in a flood of sunshine, and gave them a fine view of the brook, the meadows, and the distant hills. And over the great door, painted in red letters, was the Lawrence Museum. All Saturday morning the boys were planning how it should be furnished with their spoils, and when Mr. Lorry arrived, bringing an aquarium which Mrs. Amy said she was tired of, their rapture was great. The afternoon spent in arranging things, and when the running and lugging and hammering was over, the ladies were invited to behold the institution. It certainly was a pleasant place, airy, clean, and bright. A hop vine shook its green bells round the open window. The pretty aquarium stood in the middle of the room, with some delicate water plants rising above the water, and goldfish showing their brightness as they floated to and fro below. On either side of the window were rows of shelves ready to receive the curiosities yet to be found. Dan's tall cabinet stood before the great door, which was fastened up, while the small door was to be used. On the cabinet stood a queer Indian idol, very ugly, but very interesting. Old Mr. Lawrence sent it, as well as fine Chinese junk in full sale, which had a conspicuous place on the long table in the middle of the room. Above, swinging in a loop, and looking as if she was alive, hung Polly, who died at an advanced age, had been carefully stuffed, and was now presented by Mrs. Joe. The walls were decorated with all sorts of things. A snake's skin, a big wasp's nest, a birch-bark canoe, a string of birds' eggs, wreaths of grey moss from the south, and a bunch of cotton pods. The dead bats had a place, also a large turtle shell, and an ostrich egg, presented proudly by Demi, who volunteered to explain these rare curiosities to guests whenever they liked. There were so many stones that it was impossible to accept them all, so only a few of the best were arranged among the shells on the shelves. The rest were piled up in corners to be examined by Dan at his leisure. Every one was eager to give something, even Silas, who sent home for a stuffed wild cat killed in his youth. It was rather moth-eaten and shabby, but on a high bracket, and best side foremost, the effect was fine, for the yellow glass eyes glared, and the mouth snarled so naturally, that Teddy shook in his little shoes at sight of it, when he came bringing his most cherished treasure, one cocoon, to lay upon the shrine of science. "Isn't it beautiful? I'd no idea we had so many curious things. I gave that. Don't it look well? We might make a lot by charging something for letting folks see it." Jack added that last suggestion to the general chatter that went on as the family viewed the room. "This is a free museum, and if there is any speculating on it, I'll paint out the name over the door," said Mr. Lorry, turning so quickly that Jack wished he had held his tongue. "Hear, hear!" cried Mr. Bear. "Speech! Speech!" added Mrs. Joe. "Can't. I'm too bashful. You gave them a lecture yourself. You are used to it," Mr. Lorry answered, retreating towards the window, meaning to escape. But she held him fast, and said, laughing, as she looked at the dozen pairs of dirty hands about her, "If I did lecture, it would be on the chemical and cleansing properties of soap. Come now, as the founder of the institution, you really ought to give us a few moral remarks, and we will applaud tremendously." Seeing that there was no way of escaping, Mr. Lorry looked up at Polly hanging overhead, seemed to find inspiration in the brilliant old bird, and sitting down upon the table, said in his pleasant way, "There's one thing I'd like to suggest, boys, and that is, I want you to get some good, as well as much pleasure out of this. Just putting curious or pretty things here won't do it. So suppose you read up about them, so that when anybody asks questions you can answer them, and understand the matter. I used to like these things myself, and should enjoy hearing about them now, for I've forgotten all I once knew. It wasn't much, was it, Joe? Here's Dan now, full of stories about birds and bugs and so on. Let him take care of the museum, and once a week the rest of you take turns to read a composition or tell about some animal, mineral, or vegetable. We should all like that, and I think it would put considerable useful knowledge into our heads. What do you say, Professor?" "I like it much, and will give the lads all the help I can. But they will need books to read up these new subjects, and we have not many, I fear," began Mr. Bear, looking much pleased, planning many fine lectures on geology, which he liked. "We should have a library for the special purpose." "Is that a useful sort of book, Dan?" asked Mr. Lorry, pointing to the volume that lay open by the cabinet. "Oh, yes, it tells all I want to know about insects. I had it here to see how to fix the butterflies right. I covered it so it is not hurt." And Dan caught it up, fearing the lender might think him careless. "Give it here a minute," and pulling out his pencil, Mr. Lorry wrote Dan's name in it, saying, as he set the book up on one of the corner shelves, where nothing stood but a stuffed bird without a tail, "There, that is the beginning of the museum library. I'll hunt up some more books, and Demi shall keep them in order. Where are those jolly little books we used to read, Joe? Insect Architecture or some such name, all about ants having battles, and bees having queens, and crickets eating holes in our clothes and stealing milk, and larks of that sort. In the garret at home. I'll have them sent out, and we will plunge into natural history with a will," said Mrs. Joe, ready for anything. "Won't it be hard to write about such things?" asked Nat, who hated compositions. "At first, perhaps, but you will soon like it. If you think that hard, how would you like to have this subject given to you, as it was to a girl of 13? A conversation between Themistocles, Aristides, and Pericles on the proposed apparition of funds of the Confederacy of Delos for the ornamentation of Athens," said Mrs. Joe. The boys groaned at the mere sound of long names, and the gentlemen laughed at the absurdity of the lesson. "Did she write it?" asked Demi, in an awe-stricken tone. "Yes, but you can imagine what a piece of work she made of it, though she was rather a bright child." "I'd like to have seen it," said Mr. Bear. "Perhaps I can find it for you. I went to school with her." And Mrs. Joe looked so wicked that every one knew who the little girl was. Hearing of this fearful subject for a composition quite reconciled the boys to the thought of writing about familiar things. Wednesday afternoon was appointed for the lectures, as they preferred to call them, for some chose to talk instead of write. Mr. Bear promised a portfolio in which the written productions should be kept, and Mrs. Bear said she should attend the course with great pleasure. Then the dirty-handed society went off the wash, followed by the professor, trying to calm the anxiety of Rob, who had been told by Tommy that all water was full of invisible pollywogs. "I like your plan very much, only don't be too generous, Teddy," said Mrs. Bear, when they were left alone. "You know most of the boys have got to paddle their own canoes when they leave us, and too much sitting in the lap of luxury will unfit them for it. I'll be moderate, but do let me amuse myself. I get desperately tired of business sometimes, and nothing freshens me up like a good frolic with your boys. I like that Dan very much, Joe. He isn't demonstrative, but he has the eye of a hawk, and when you have tamed him a little he will do you credit." "I'm so glad you think so. Thank you very much for your kindness to him, especially for the museum affair. It will keep him happy while he is lame. Give me a chance to soften and smooth this poor, rough lad, and make him love us." "What did inspire you with such a beautiful, helpful idea, Teddy?" asked Mrs. Bear, glancing back at the pleasant room as she turned to leave it. Laurie took both her hands in his, and answered with a look that made her eyes fill with happy tears. "Dear Joe, I have known what it is to be a motherless boy, and I never can forget how much you and yours have done for me all these years." End of chapter 11.